is Sofia Ehrich, and I am an art historian, academic researcher, and curator of multisensory experiences. Right now, my main work is with the European-funded project Odoropa, which advocates for smells and smelling as important to Europe's cultural heritage. It is my pleasure to welcome you as the host of the Internet of Senses podcast for the Sense of Smell. And today I have Pamela Dalton with me, who is a cognitive psychologist and has a PhD in experimental psychology and a master's in public health. She is currently the principal investigator of the Monell Chemical Senses Center and co-chair of the Monell postdoctoral training program. And we'll talk today also about the Monell Center, so I'll introduce what the Monell Center is. Founded over 50 years ago, the Monell Center is an independent nonprofit science institute in the United States that conducts basic research on the chemical senses. A leader in scientific discovery, Monell's world-class scientists advance understanding of taste and smell to benefit human health and well-being. The center's outstanding interdisciplinary research programs incorporate approaches that range from molecular biology to behavioral neuroscience, from analytical chemistry to comparative sensory ecology and clinical work with human patients. So welcome today, Pamela. Thanks for joining me.
It's my pleasure.
Okay, so today we will, of course, talk about smell, but we'll also talk about all of the senses, or the chemosensory senses specifically, health and safety, non-lethal weapon development, which I'm really curious about, and also the Monell Chemical Senses Center. So my first question for you today to start the conversation is, can you start by explaining to our audience what your main research interests are, because there are many, I think, and your journey to starting your personal research on olfaction or our sense of smell?
Happy to do so. Well, I've always been intrigued by the way smells intertwine themselves into our life's experience. And so I've always had very fond memories that were revived by odors and smells that I associated with people, places, and things. And so when I first started using smell in graduate school, I used it as a context cue. I tried to understand how being in the presence of a particular odor that you had first experienced something in would help you remember or recognize that person or that place a second time. So I didn't know much about the way the brain worked with odor, the sense of olfaction. I was concentrating mostly on things like visual perception, learning, and memory. And I became so intrigued with how important the sense of smell is to our navigating through the world on an everyday basis that I decided to pursue it more regularly. And so most of my interests involve how people perceive, detect, and experience the odor world around them. Now, that could also be things that they put on their body, but it's also things that waft to us in the air, and how we evaluate whether those are odors that we should stick around or we should go away from, and how our own experience, our personal experience, guides us to interpret the odor world in different ways. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. But I really study the whole range of human reaction to the sensory world that's brought to us by our noses.
Okay, very interesting. When you were speaking, I was thinking about how I was talking to someone about my smell touch synesthesia. So I have smell touch synesthesia. So when I smell something, I can feel it in my hands or on my feet. I've had as well. And I find it interesting in analyzing this myself that I only have smell touch synesthesia when I'm actively smelling, and not when I'm just smelling in the environment around me. So when something just wafts into my nose when I'm walking around. So this idea of how smell impacts you while you're kind of subconsciously absorbing smells through your nose, or whether you're actively doing so, I'm also fascinated by that.
It's actually very interesting because we find that in studies, and of course, when you're doing a study with someone, they know they're in a study, right? And it's obvious that it's somewhat of an artificial setup, no matter how you're testing them. So it doesn't actually mimic their everyday life. But what has emerged over time in lots and lots of studies is that sometimes behavior is more affected in the presence of an odor that we're not consciously paying attention to. It's almost as if we start paying attention to it, or if our attention is somehow drawn to it by the experimenter in a study, that we start to process it differently than if it's sort of passive. And I'm not saying we can't smell it, we could smell it, but it's going under the level of conscious awareness. And that seems to be the experience where odors have the most impact on behavior. Perhaps when we're consciously recognizing it, we sort of compensate and say, well, I'm not going to feel relaxed with this odor. But if it comes to us and we're not thinking about it, it can have that experience.
Yeah, and I definitely am more aware since I've been working in an olfactory related research project. I'm definitely more aware of the scents that are around me outside or in my house. I always feel like I'm overwhelmed a little bit by scents now. So I wonder if that's because I'm learning to be aware of them through my job. So I don't know if you have this feeling as well.
Almost certainly. In fact, I've been doing this for so long that it's hard to remember a time when I wasn't aware of the odor environment around me, and probably the first person to notice something or comment on it. But when I hire people to work, let's say, as technicians in my laboratory that have never worked in an olfaction environment before, it doesn't take very long, usually about a month, and they will start coming into work and saying, I can't believe how I'm now paying attention to all these odors in my home or in the environment, the neighborhood where I live, that were probably always there, but I just never noticed them. So I think it really does help to open up another dimension of our sensory world. And in fact, there is pretty good evidence that the more we do that, the more we can maintain and preserve our sense of smell throughout the lifespan.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot on this podcast about losing your sense of smell. And I know that you work with the Monell Center not only with smell, but with the chemical senses, so also with taste.
Mhm.
And so, what happens when someone loses their sense of taste or their gustatory sense, or they have dysfunction of that? How does it impact taste and flavor?
It's actually pretty devastating. I mean, if you can imagine putting something in your mouth that is, the consistency of cardboard and has no sweet, sour, salty, bitter, no sensation whatsoever, it really diminishes one's appetite and one's willingness to consume food or beverages. If you couple that with a loss of smell, which is where we get most of the flavor dimension of food, this is devastating for people. Something that was once a pleasurable experience, or at the very least, a survival way of experiencing the world. These senses work together and can help one another by augmenting. If you lose a little bit of your sense of smell, not completely, you can do things with your sense of taste, or even the sense of what we call chemosensation, which is our ability to taste the hotness of chili peppers or the cooling of menthol, for example. And there's a lot that can be done with texture to try to augment the sensory systems when one of them goes a little by the wayside. But generally, it can be a very life-altering experience when any of these sensory systems start to decline.
And is it usually coupled together? Like when you lose your sense of smell, you also lose your taste? Or is it not connected in that way that you can keep one and not the other?
Absolutely, you can. And to be clear, it is much more likely that you will lose your sense of smell than taste, even though fortunately, until COVID, that was a pretty rare event for most people. But loss of taste usually comes about because of medical problems that people are having, treatments, either like radiation or chemotherapy, or even drugs that they're taking, where their taste is altered so that things were pleasurable before now are not so much. but you can lose both of them together. You can lose one or you can lose the other. And all of that sequela will necessarily alter the way you approach food and beverages and everyday life.
Yeah, for sure. And I think with COVID, we've been talking a lot about losing your sense of smell, but not so much. Well, people think they're losing their sense of taste, actually, but we know that it's smell. But not, we haven't talked much about losing your sense of taste on the podcast. So I wanted to see like
Mhm.
what's the difference. So that's very interesting. And what did you call the sense with the trigeminal nerve?
Chemosthesis. It's the scientific term for activating the trigeminal nerve through either something we put in our mouth, something we put in our nose. Obviously with chili peppers, if you rub your eye, you'll feel it there too, and you'll start to tear up. But in the oral cavity, and sometimes even in the nasal cavity, it's a pleasurable sensation. I mean, I really like things that have a spice from peppers. I like things that have cooling sometimes, from any of the mint or menthol compounds that we put in food. And so having that third sensory system that is so integral to the way we experience food and beverages can help when one of the other sensory systems starts to decline.
Great. And going on to senses and health and safety, I was curious about how you define a malodor because you've researched a lot malodors or bad smells and body odors and hazardous chemicals. So how do you define a malodor and what sorts of properties do you consider when you're classifying these types of odors? And of course, cultural perception or subjectivity has something to do with this. So yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, to any individual, a malodor could be defined as something that you find to be very unpleasant, right? It's an odor sensation that you personally find to be either disgusting, repellent, or, even mildly unpleasant. You would call it a malodor. We tend to think that there are certain classes of malodors, but if we're trying to find something that is sort of universal or universally considered to be a malodor, we often move to things that are sort of biological in origin, assuming that, everyone will have had a common experience. So while certain foods, let's say in some cultures that are much enjoyed, would be considered malodorous in other cultures that don't experience that from an early age, there are still some categories of odors. I can think of like fecal waste, for example, that we generally all consider to be malodorous. Now, it may vary depending on whether it's your odor or a stranger's odor, but because of the nature of the source, even though the odor can't harm us, we don't want to smell it. It's almost like a protective mechanism that says, this might not be good for me. I should get out of here. And some people have very dramatic responses to malodors. I mean, some people feel very nauseated by smelling something that is unpleasant to them, and yet it may not bother the next person sitting next to them. So there's a lot of variation. But we look for, when we did studies to try to understand universal responses to malodors, we did indeed pick things that we thought were biological in origin because they would stand a better chance of having a common experience across many different cultures.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Like fecal waste. Is there another kind of category that you would say?
Yeah, we looked at vomit odor, for example. Yeah, we also looked at rotting garbage, the smells of organic decomposition. Things that are carbon-based and have sulfur in them are generally considered more malodorous than, let's say, a floral odor or a baking odor. So those were the ones that we started with, assuming that everyone would have had at least a couple of negative experiences in response to an odor like that. Yes.
Yeah, and of course, it's also about what you presented with because cheese can smell very bad if you don't see the source of the cheese. But if you have the source of the cheese, then you're like, oh, it's cheese. Great. So when you do studies, do you pair these with some sort of other input, like other than the smell, or do you only have the smell present for the people?
It depends on the study, but yes, we have paired odors with different images because we tend to be more influenced by and have more confidence in our visual perception than our olfactory perception, which is not surprising and probably is well-founded given that we are much more, we get much more feedback from our visual environment. We don't usually walk through the world identifying odors and having someone tell us, yep, right, wrong, close, but not quite right. So we don't have a lot of confidence without seeing the source of an odor as to what it is. In fact, when we do odor identification in the laboratory, as a clinical test, it has to be what we call cued identification, meaning we give people 4 options. We don't just say, what is this odor? We say, which of these 4 options does this odor smell the most like? Because if you don't do that, performance is abysmal. But if you give people 4 options, they're much better if they have a good sense of smell to be able to get it correct.
So you present a smell and then you present 4 options of, say, images, and then that person decides which image it is most compatible with, you could say.
Absolutely. That's the way almost all odor identification tests are done, because if you don't give people any alternatives, you have very low accuracy rate. So when you pair an odor with an image, you are essentially providing the whole context around how an individual should interpret that odor and how they should feel about it. So as you mentioned, there are many chemical odors that exist in many different sources in the world, right? You talked about cheese. Well, there's a chemical in cheese. It's called butyric acid. It's a short chain fatty acid. It has an unpleasant smell, but particularly unpleasant when we think of the source of it as being human sweat or body odors, for example. And yet, that same odor, when it's an aged cheese, is thought as very appetitive. And so by pairing that odor with different images or potentially different sources, you can have the same person have radically different experiences, pleasant or unpleasant, depending on the way they conceptualize what the source of that odor is.
Yeah, and I think they will tell you, right? Right?
Yes, yes, yes.
So I also read a few articles where you responded as an expert about the effect of certain odorants on people and how their behavior changed in a certain environment. So can you tell us more about your role when it comes to instances of public disturbance and smells and the ways that you've contributed knowledge in this respect?
Well, it's not uncommon in communities, and let's face it, there are many, many, many sources of odors in our environment, some good, some bad, some neutral. And depending on the source of the odor, whether it's a bakery or refinery or agricultural operation like a pig farm or a chicken farm, the odors that emanate from that are usually not constant. They're sort of intermittent, but depending on what people are thinking about the source of that odor in an environment, there can be radically different perceptions in a community. And one of the things that happens is that, the more people talk about it and the more people think about it, they can build up, impressions of how safe the odor might be or unsafe it is. That's all going to go into their own experience of how anxious they get or how stressed they feel when they experience that odor. So that's where it's important that people understand what exactly an odor represents, whether or not it can represent a health risk. One of the things that I think can be most valuable to let people know in a community is that the human sense of smell is far better than what we've been led to believe or what we think we can do. We're always sort of under the impression that we're at the low end of the olfactory, sensory realm, and that many animals are so far superior to us. And that actually has turned out not to be true. People can smell many chemicals, particularly some of the ones that are sulfur-based, at parts per billion, parts per trillion. I mean, we're talking talking tiny, tiny amounts. That's how sensitive the human sense of smell is for many of these odorants. And if we don't understand that, and something smells in our environment and it might smell even moderate or strong, we tend to overestimate how much of that chemical is present. Now, that doesn't mean it might not annoy you, but it means that you need to understand that that small amount that you can still smell very distinctly is not necessarily harmful. And I think that's a very good message for communities to understand. They still may not want to smell the odor on a regular basis, but they shouldn't have to worry about whether it's impacting their health.
And this is a really random question that I'm just throwing at you here, so forgive me for this. In terms of like the Odoropa project, we talked a lot about smells as heritage and like the smells that are very important to a certain identity or a certain culture. What do you think about this in terms of like analyzing environmental smells and smells that you may experience maybe in a factory or in a farm? What do you think of these being considered maybe heritage to some people?
I think it's perfectly fascinating and appropriate. I mean, just the way objects and sounds are part of the way that we capture our heritage, there's absolutely no reason not to embrace odors as a way of recapitulating a particular historic era. When I've had the opportunity to work with some artists on exhibitions where odors need to be, or odors are desired to be part of the sensory experience, having a history of the site or what we're trying to achieve is critical to making something that is bigger than just, putting an odor in an environment, but really bringing a passage of time back to life in the present. And odors can do that better than any other sensory system that we know. So it's absolutely wonderful.
And is there any smell out there that you've experienced that you think, okay, we should try to capture this?
I tend to be pretty agnostic on the good, bad smell side. I mean, to me, smells are just, they're my medium that I work in, that I experience, and that sort of thing. So, I mean, I grew up on barrier islands. And so the smell both of the ocean, which has, sort of a funky salinity smell, and also because we have the bay with all of the anaerobic digestion of the, in the mud, those two smells to me speak of a home and a comfort and a nurturing. And that's true for many people, that haven't maybe experienced that in years, and they'll drive down to an area and get a whiff of that. And suddenly they start remembering all sorts of things about things that happened 20, 40, 50 years ago. So it's a wonderful way into not just a cultural heritage, but one's own sense of history that can be revived by smell.
Thank you for that answer. Going to a completely different topic now, which I'm also very curious about, is non-lethal weapon development. Sounds a little scary, but I think we'll unpack that a little bit more now. So can you tell me what non-lethal weapon development is and what it has to do with smell?
Well, non-lethal weapon development is any activity that is meant to provide a way to alter human behavior, but do so without harming the individual. And so,
So it's not so scary.
Yeah, we have a lot of ways of altering people's activities and behavior that can hurt them. But in this arena, we want to do things, we want to modify behavior in ways that don't harm a person, but may make them want to stop what they're doing, leave an area, not enter an area, things like that. And many governments around the world have been working on this because it's a sane and safe way of attacking or approaching many different situations. But in my case, there were questions about how universal any odor could be across broad populations, for example, culturally across the world, not just within the United States. And it is a question that has been asked and never satisfactorily answered, because unlike the taste system, where infant humans and infant mammals are born with inborn preferences and aversions. So every mammal will avidly lick or suck something sweet shortly after birth, but they will reject anything that tastes bitter until they get much older and realize that it's not harmful. And so we don't have that in the olfactory system. We don't have any evidence that we are born liking or disliking any particular odors. The available evidence is that it's all based on our own experience. And so that's why the question of, is there a universal malodor that could be deployed to alter people's behavior, is so interesting, because given the evidence that we have that everything is learned, then we have to look for things that would be common and universal, that everyone would have had the experience. And that really restricts the range of odors that you're going to be able to use.
Yeah, and if you compare that with sound, I know that there are some places where they'll put that really high-pitched noise that, like, only people under 20 can hear or something, so to deter young people from crowding in certain places. So, like, something like that, then okay, this is kind of a universal sound that people don't wanna hear, or certain groups don't wanna hear, so that doesn't work so well with smells, I guess.
It's a little more difficult to find something that would motivate everyone's behavior to the same degree. Well, I mean, but that's also true even with the sound. Some people will be more bothered than others. Someone at my age won't even hear it, probably. So, I can hang out there forever, but I'm not the problem that they're trying to address. So yes, so there's variation, but there's more variation given that we know that the response to odors is largely based on our own experience. Then it requires an individual to have had an experience that deems that to be a malodor. Now, I will also say that in many contexts, even the introduction of a chemical that has an odor, but that you can't see the source, can be a source of concern, right? When we walk even into a familiar environment and all of a sudden we smell something that we didn't recognize and probably think shouldn't be there, we're on alert, right? We may actually leave the environment because we're worried about what that represents. So there is also that element of unknown exposure in using any odor as a non-lethal weapon. But still, you want to target something that people are going to find either unpleasant enough that they'll leave, or that they won't even go into an area that will somehow alter their behavior in a non-lethal way.
And so you've created or have developed a smell that is kind of a universal malodor called stench soup. Do you want to talk a little bit
Right.
about that?
Believe it or not, there was actually a formula that had existed probably back in the 40s in the US that was called Who Me, that actually had more of a, let's say, the odor of flatulence, a lot of sulfur compounds in it. So the idea being that, someone in a small area would suddenly get offended by this odor, people would disperse. But we took the building blocks of that and tried to come up with something that would have a little bit more oomph, a little more power to repel and disgust people. And so we added a little bit more fecal components, but we also added, and this was based on feedback I got from people who heard about the project and just wanted to volunteer, what was their worst odor that they'd ever smelt. And one person said the worst experience they ever had was a sewage backup in their restaurant where they tried to clean it up and used a very perfumey kind of cleanser, and they said that was the absolute worst. So it smelled like fruity poop or something like that, and it was absolutely revolting. Even the people who hadn't minded cleaning up the backup were now all retching and everything when this fruity odor was applied to try to clean it up. So that was sort of the inspiration we took to add something in there that at first whiff would be almost pleasant, and then all of a sudden you would get hit with this really unpleasant rest of the experience. And that was sort of the genesis of stench soup.
That is so true. When you're trying to cover up a bad smell with a good smell, it never goes well.
Exactly.
So it's very true. That's so cool. So you've also worked with PTSD and smell. So how have your discoveries informed training operations for the military?
Well, we've done some work understanding essentially how odors can be associated with stress states. And in fact, in non-military personnel, we established a protocol for having someone become stressed in the laboratory while they were in the presence of an odor, and then would bring them back in a week or two and simply have them do a task, but then slowly infuse the odor that had been associated with stress in there. And we would be measuring things like their heart rate, their respiration rate, skin conductance, all measures of arousal, as well as their ability to do the task. And what we found is that even that one experience with a neutral odor, one that they didn't have a lot of familiarity with, when it was paired with stress, was enough to cause them to have a stress response a week or two later when just re-exposed to that odor. And so thinking about this in the context of how people deployed in very dangerous, scary situations in the military often are exposed to novel odors in a culture, cooking odors, agricultural odors, things that might be different than their town in Iowa or New York City. And now they're experiencing this stress in the presence of odors that are unique to a military deployment. That can become so associated that when stressful thing, and let's face it, their stress is going to be way higher than the stress that I provided to my experimental participants in Monell, where all they had to do was give a public speech and do backward subtraction, of numbers. That can come back and be a persistent problem even when they're back home again. And what we find is that even things that are similar to the odors that they experienced can revive those awful memories. And that is really a form of PTSD. So obviously, when we did these studies, we found that if you were exposed to these odors, these unique odors in our participants prior to the stressful situation, it almost inoculated you, prevented you from having that stress memory association to the odor. And so that was our recommendation, is that training should involve exposure to odors that are going to be experienced in the deployment zone, so that they would not have the ability to become associated with the obviously the stressful situations that one would encounter.
It's also interesting to think about that it's not just the typical smells of war that we may think of when we think of war, but also these maybe certain cooking smells or certain smells that might be native to that environment. I haven't thought about that before, so that's
Yeah,
new for
yeah,
me. And
yeah.
so then in the military trainings, did they do that? They tried to introduce smells that would be part of the environment in which they would be fighting.
Yeah, I've not been part of that. My work was here at Monell in the laboratory and
Okay.
just telling them, but in conversations with individuals who are part of that effort, my understanding is that there has been more incorporation of to be experienced odors in the training environment. And that's particularly true given that a lot of the deployment situations are in small towns and cities now, where, you're not out in a field and you're only experiencing the smell of gunfire, right? You may be, you may be in a city or a small town where there are unique odors associated with that. And so that pre-knowledge and the pre-inoculation of having been exposed to it before you're under stress can be very valuable.
And it's much easier to be introduced early to the scent in a way which could be considered or less stressful than to be introduced to the odor when you're stressed and then try to undo that feeling.
Yes.
It's almost impossible, right?
We can extinguish those kinds of associations in therapists' offices, but it is difficult. It takes many experiences to reduce the power of that odor to bring back those memories. And it also requires the individual to re-experience both the odor and the memory again. So it's not easy and it's not pleasant. It can be done. I've done it myself when I had an experience with a mugger who was a glue sniffer. And for months afterwards, just the smell of glue, without me realizing it, would cause my heart to race. And I eventually extinguished that association, but it took some time for me to realize, one, what was causing these intermittent panic attacks, and two, how to go about getting rid of it.
I know we've talked a little bit about the Monell Center throughout this conversation, but now I specifically want to ask you about what the Monell Chemical Science Center is.
Okay, so the best way I can describe it is it's a group of people who think that understanding smell and taste and chemosynthesis is the most important thing to do in science. We do have buildings, but when I think of Monell, I think of all the scientists, all the technicians and science personnel that have come through my life over 30 years and that I've been introduced to and been able to work alongside. People who really have been at the forefront of understanding the basic biology and physiology of smell and taste and the ability to experience spices. And more importantly, not only the basic biology, but how that gets translated, how it affects our health, our appetite, our everyday experience, our mood. And all of those things are vitally important when you think about how the sense of smell and taste and chemosynthesis reaches everything that we do all day long. I mean, if we're breathing and we have a sense of smell, we are experiencing the olfactory world with every breath. And I think Monell has really existed for 55 years now as the only scientific institute that's devoted to studying these systems, because over time, people have realized just how valuable it is to understand them and all the implications of when they work and when they don't.
And what types of research or achievements has the Monell Center made in the last 55 years?
Well,
I'm sure there are many, but just to name a few.
Everything from identifying receptors for bitter taste and, all sorts of things in the basic biology and physiology. But, we're also doing important work in understanding, the chemical world around us. Our former director was instrumental in identifying a compound in olive oil called which was named oleocanthal, which is a natural anti-inflammatory. And the way he did it is because the experience of this olive oil was actually triggered the same sensation in the back of the throat as he did when he experienced ibuprofen in a different study. And so he put those two things together and they isolated this compound, which is probably not only anti-inflammatory, it's being investigated for cancer treatments and all sorts of things. So that's a wonderful example of how a sensory system could lead you to the identification of, a chemical in a complex mixture that has existed forever, but wasn't unknown until someone put the sensory cues together. And of course, we do a lot of work. We have a lot of people working on appetite and how the brain and the gut work together to when we smell or taste something, we start pre-processing that food before we've even put it in our mouth. And understanding all of that is vitally important to understanding how we're going to digest and metabolize nutrition. And so there's so many areas that our basic field touches that it's actually, we could hire another 100 people and we still wouldn't run out of questions to ask and answer.
It's so fun. I also just love that you're just a group of people that think this is important. I mean, that we need that.
Yeah, exactly.
Considering our sense of smell, how can that inform us on new models of education or training about eating better and making healthier choices? Because I know you talked about this research between the brain and the gut, or this research about olive oil and anti-inflammation. So yeah, how can our sense of smell help inform other strategies?
Well, it's clear that we don't eat things that we don't find palatable unless we're forced to, right? I mean, wait, how something tastes, and when I say taste, I mean, the flavor, the smell, the taste, the texture, all of that drives what we eat and what we choose to bring into our homes to prepare and cook. So the challenge is, there's a lot of biology about sweet taste in children and adults that it was important in a different era, in the modern era, where it's so easy to find food that is easily digested, that has high carbohydrate content, high sugar content, that we gravitate to because our nature, our biological nature says, well, this is important for for energy, these compounds. We need to work on palatability for foods that are equally nutritious without some of the negative connotations. And that's something that can be done, but it has to be very carefully done. So, if we don't like the way it tastes or smells, it's, unless we're really, really, really devoted to, a healthy diet, we're going to gravitate to things that we enjoy putting in our mouth. And that's the challenge for food producers, to be able to understand how to make things equally palatable that are as healthy for us as some of the natural foods that we would, otherwise consume.
Before I ask my conclusion question, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I learned so much from you. So thank you so much for all of your answers. And yeah, it's been a real pleasure to learn from you today. So you told me the Monell Center has been working for 55 years now. So I wanted to conclude the podcast by asking how this research and achievements have shaped the future of this field and our industry, and what is the most important topic to focus on for future research in olfaction.
Okay, well, apart from all the scientific discoveries that have been made by Monell scientists, I want to also highlight the fact that we consider one of our major missions is the training of new scientists in the chemical senses, because there really aren't programs in universities and colleges to do this. Most people that come to Monell do so without a background in smell and taste in the chemical senses. And so we think that's very important. And we actually like to bring people in who come from different fields and then introduce them to this area. Now, whether they become a chemosensory scientist fully or they simply gain an appreciation and incorporate some of that into their work, the Monell Center, I would say, is equally proud of all of the people who have come through the laboratories at Monell and now work in industry or academia or government all over the world. And so that's, in addition to the scientific discoveries, I think that is one of our other major products that we are most proud of, is the training of scientists in this important area. And to get to your second part of the question, what is the most important focus in future research? I just spent 2 days at a workshop that was trying to understand both what we call the normal aging of the olfactory system and when the olfactory system is a biomarker for other disease states. And we've always known that neurodegenerative disease, when I say always, in my time in the field, it's always been known that neurodegenerative diseases are preceded by, in many cases, olfactory loss, even before you have memory or cognitive dysfunction, or let's say in Parkinson's, motor deficits. But they've never really been used as a diagnostic until now. And part of the reason is because there are other reasons you might lose your sense of smell. It's not a definite diagnosis. It's not that sensitive. It is specific, though, because people can tell you if you're 64 years old and you have a very good sense of smell, it is almost not likely that you will develop any, neurodegenerative disease within the next 10 years. That's how predictive it is of continued good health. So now we have a lot of people who have lost their sense of smell at a very young age due to COVID, which is something that was both a terrible experience and in my field actually allowed us to make some amazing discoveries about what goes wrong when a virus attacks the olfactory system. And so now we need to look to the future health of those individuals. Is it really that the sense of smell is a biomarker of these other processes, or is there something about the loss of smell that causes changes in the brain? We know the smell is part of the limbic system, which is our emotional regulation system. People who lose their sense of smell are often depressed, and it's beyond, I just can't enjoy food anymore. It's actually a clinical depression. So there's a lot we need to know and understand about the next 20 years in this saga that we're going forth. And if it is as much of a biomarker of a health endpoint as we're coming to believe it is, we think it's very important that everyone gets this sensory system tested at least a couple times, particularly as you are hitting middle age and getting older as well. So those are where some of our most important initiatives are being focused at the present time.
And right now, olfactory testing is not typical at all, or is it typical in if you have signs of Parkinson's, will they say, let's do an olfactory test or not?
Some clinics will do that, yes. It's hit or miss, really. Even in an ENT office where you go and you say, I can't smell, I haven't smelled since I had, this virus or this head injury. Some places will test you and some won't because there's no reimbursement code in insurance for testing sense of smell. You have to pair it with another thing. It can be done, but, getting the test reimbursed, getting the physician's time reimbursed, all of those are things that are not standard right now. And until that happens, we probably won't see people getting their sense of smell checked the way they get their vision checked, for example.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a very important message to end on, is that not only do we need to continue to spread the knowledge of olfaction or of the specialization or expertise of olfactory, I don't know how to say it, but in many of these fields, we see that there's only a few of us when it comes to the sense of smell. And so I know I've said it before, but it's really important that we continue to spread that knowledge. And at the same time, that the sense of smell becomes a tool where we know, okay, if you test the sense of smell, you might know then that you have a certain disease or this. And I think right now we still are questioning our sense of smell so much that we don't see it as a tool that can uncover other things. So I think those are two very important points that you mentioned. So thank you so much for bringing those two up.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today, Pamela, and for taking your time. I really learned a lot and enjoyed interviewing you.
Sophia, it's been a wonderful experience chatting with you, and your Odor Europa project is something that I'm vitally interested in and look forward to hearing more about in the future. Thank you for having me.